The winter of 1923 came early to Darke County, Ohio, and by the second week of November, the frost had already killed what remained of the kitchen, gardens, and laced the window glass of every farmhouse along the Ansonia Road, with patterns that looked, in certain lights, like lace that had been pressed there and forgotten. The sky sat low and white and without variation, the kind of sky that made distances hard to judge and made everything beneath it feel temporary, as though the land itself understood it was being tested. The corn had come in short that year, 9 days behind schedule and lighter than the county average by 11 bushels per acre, and the farmers who had borrowed against their expected yields were already sitting down with pencils and pieces of paper, working arithmetic that did not work. It was the kind of autumn that made strong men quiet and made quiet men desperate, and at the end of a rutted lane, 3 miles east of the town of Greenville, on a 47-acre property that backed up against a stand of bare-limbed sycamores along the edge of Painter Creek, there was a white farmhouse with a green door, and on that green door, someone had tacked a notice in an envelope, and the notice had been there since morning, and the woman who lived in that house had not yet opened it. Her name was Annie Oakley, and she was 62 years old, and she had come home. That sentence required the whole of her life to make sense. She had been born Phoebe Ann Mosey in this same county in August of 1860, the fifth of 7 children in a family that understood poverty, not as a temporary condition, but as the permanent weather of their lives. Her father, Jacob Mosey, had died of exposure in the winter of 1866, caught in a blizzard while driving his wagon back from the mill, and after that the family's decline had not been gradual. It had been immediate and complete. Her mother, Susan, had done what she could, which was not enough. Phoebe Ann, who was 6 years old when her father died, and 8 years old when she first picked up a rifle and walked into the woods behind the house to shoot something they could eat, had understood hunger not as an abstraction, but as a specific physical weight in the stomach, a weight she had carried for years. She had learned to shoot because there was no other option. She had learned to shoot well because she was constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway. By the time she was 10 years old, she was providing more meat for her family's table than any of the adult neighbors could have managed, and by the time she was 15, she had paid off the mortgage on the family home, the first family home, the one on the other side of the county, with money earned from a game to a hotel in Cincinnati that supplied its restaurant from local hunters. She had been 15 years old, and she had paid off a mortgage, and she had done it alone. What happened after that was the story that the rest of the world knew, or thought it knew. The shooting competition in Cincinnati in 1875, when she was not quite 16 and her opponent was a traveling exhibition marksman named Frank Butler, who had never expected to lose and had certainly never expected to lose to a girl from the Ohio backcountry who shot with a rifle that was older than some of the buildings in Cincinnati. She had beaten him. She had beaten him cleanly and without apology, and then she had, over the course of the following year, allowed him to court her, and in 1876 she had married him, taking his surname as her professional name alongside the stage name she had already chosen. Annie Oakley, simple and clean and nothing like Phoebe Ann Mosey, which was the name of a girl who had been hungry. Annie Oakley was someone else entirely. Annie Oakley did not miss. The years with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show had been extraordinary years. Years of European tours and command, performances and crowds of 10,000 people watching her shoot the ash from the tip of a cigarette held between Frank Butler's lips at 30 feet. Years of her name on posters in cities she had never imagined as a child along Painter Creek. She had met Queen Victoria. She had met Sitting Bull, who had called her Little Sure Shot, and meant it as the highest compliment a Lakota warrior chief could offer. She had performed for presidents and kaisers and princes, and she had done it all with a composure that people mistook for arrogance because they had no other framework for a woman who was simply not afraid of being watched. She was not arrogant, she was precise. Those were different things. And then the decades turned, as decades do, and the show era passed, and Frank Butler aged. And Annie Oakley had come through a train wreck in 1901 that left her partially paralyzed for months and required 5 spinal surgeries, and had, somehow, impossibly, not broken her, and an automobile accident in 1922 that had injured her right leg badly enough to require a steel brace from ankle to hip, and through all of it, she had kept shooting. kept performing at exhibitions and benefits and trap shoots, kept placing the rifle to her cheek with the same economy of motion she had used at 16 in Cincinnati. She had kept going because stopping was not something she knew how to do. But by the late autumn of 1923, she and Frank had come back to Darke County, to this particular farmhouse on this particular lane. Because Frank's health had been failing in ways that did not respond to the warmer climates, where they had spent recent winters, and because Annie had decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, that she wanted to be where she was from. She had purchased the farmhouse in April of 1923, with money that was, by the standards of their touring years, modest, and by the standards of Darke County in 1923, comfortable. She had paid $4,200 for the house, and the 47 acres, and the small barn, and the hand pump, well in the side yard. She had paid it in full. There had been no mortgage. That had been important to her, the no mortgage part. She understood what mortgages did. What she had not accounted for was the Darke County Consolidated Tax Assessment of October 1923, which had recalculated the property valuations for the entire eastern corridor of the county, using a new methodology developed by the county assessor's office that seemed, to everyone who looked at it carefully, designed to increase the taxable value of small agricultural properties while leaving the larger landholdings largely unchanged. Annie Oakley's 47 acres along Painter Creek had been assessed at a value that was, by the new calculation, 41% higher than it had been when she purchased it 8 months before. The resulting tax notice, which had arrived in September, demanded payment of $168 by December 1st. She had been able to pay it. What she had not been able to anticipate was the supplemental assessment that the county assessor's office issued in late October, the one that arrived in the envelope on her green door, which added an additional $89 to the original demand and moved the payment deadline to November 22nd, which was 12 days away, which included, buried in its third paragraph in language that was legally precise and practically incomprehensible, a provision that failure to pay by the stated deadline would result in the county placing a lien on the property, sufficient to initiate foreclosure proceedings under the Ohio Revised Code. $168 had been manageable, but she had paid it already. The additional $89 arrived at the same time as Frank's doctor bills from the specialist in Dayton, $42, and the cost of heating oil for the coming winter, which she had prepaid in October at $63. Because the price was lower then than it would be in January. She had $26 in the household account at the Greenville Savings and Trust. She was Annie Oakley. She was famous and she was 62 years old, and she had $26 in the bank, and a notice on her door, and the notice said that if she did not pay $89 in 12 days, the county could take the home she had bought outright 6 months before. The county assessor's office was run by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had held the position for 11 years, and who was not, by any honest accounting, a cruel man. He was an administrator. He performed his functions according to the codes and schedules that governed them, and if those codes and schedules produced outcomes that fell harder on some people than on others, that was not, in his view, a reflection of his intentions. He had a staff of 4. He processed 342 property accounts for the Eastern Corridor alone. He had a budget that the county commission had reduced twice in 5 years, and a pile of outstanding assessments that grew every quarter. He was not looking for people to hurt. He was maintaining a system that hurt people as a function of its operation, and the distinction seemed important to him. The new assessment methodology had been developed with the assistance of a Columbus-based consulting firm called the Ohio Agricultural Appraisal Bureau, which the county had contracted at a rate of $400 for a study that recommended, among other things, that the county bring its rural property valuations in line with current market rates to capture lost tax revenue, that the commission needed to fund road maintenance and school operations. The methodology was not illegal. It was not even unusual. 7 other Ohio counties had adopted similar approaches in the preceding 3 years. What it did, consistently and predictably, was increase the tax burden on small landowners who had purchased their properties recently, because the new valuations were tied to recent sale prices rather than long-term assessed values. It was, in other words, a formula that charged people more for having just bought something. The consultants had noted this effect in a footnote on page 31 of their study. The county commission had not read page 31. The people this affected most were the people least equipped to absorb it. A woman named Loretta Brandt, who had bought 12 acres near the northern edge of the affected corridor in March of 1923, had received a supplemental assessment of $61 in October and had gone to the assessor's office to contest it. She had been told that the assessment had been correctly calculated and that the proper avenue for dispute was a formal appeal to the County Board of Revision, which accepted appeals on a quarterly schedule, and whose next meeting was not until February of the following year, which was 3 months after the payment deadline. The formal appeal process was, in other words, structurally useless for anyone facing an imminent deadline. Loretta Brandt had paid the $61 by selling 2 of her laying hens and borrowing the balance from her sister-in-law in Piqua, a man named Caleb Rowbottom, who farmed 31 acres near the eastern edge of the corridor, and whose supplemental assessment came to $74, had gone to the assessor's office twice, spoken to Gerald Pruitt directly on the second visit, and been told, not unkindly, not dismissively, just factually, that there was no mechanism for waiving the assessment short of a formal appeal. Rowbottom had missed the deadline and the county had filed the lien, and Rowbottom had spent 4 months working through the legal process to remove it, during which time he could not refinance or sell or borrow against his property. He had eventually cleared it. The process had cost him, in legal fees and interest and lost time, nearly $200. Annie Oakley had gone to the assessor's office on the 3rd of November, 8 days after finding the envelope on her door, 3 days after reading its contents carefully enough to understand what it said. She had driven herself in the Ford that Frank could no longer drive because his hands shook too badly, and she had walked into the assessor's office without an appointment and waited 40 minutes on a bench near the window while Gerald Pruitt finished a meeting she could hear through the door but not understand. When Pruitt came out and recognized her, and he did recognize her, everyone in Darke County knew who she was. She was the most famous person the county had ever produced. He had been genuinely respectful. He had offered her coffee. He had pulled her file himself. He had sat across from her at his desk and explained, carefully and without condescension, the methodology by which the supplemental assessment had been calculated. And he had shown her the relevant section of the Ohio Revised Code, and he had explained the formal appeal process, and he had explained its timeline. And when she asked whether there was any avenue other than the formal appeal, he had paused for a long moment and then said that he was not aware of one. She had thanked him. She had driven home. She had sat at the kitchen table while Frank slept in the next room, and she had written 3 letters to a friend in Cincinnati who owed her no favors, but who she thought might have connections to county-level political figures, one to a lawyer in Greenville, whose name she had gotten from the hardware store owner on Main Street, and one to the Ohio Bureau of Taxation in Columbus, which she had addressed as carefully and precisely as she addressed everything, knowing that letters to state bureaus often went nowhere but unwilling not to try. The lawyer had written back in 4 days. His name was Thomas Edgerton, and he was 28 years old, and he had reviewed her description of the situation and confirmed what Gerald Pruitt had told her, that a formal appeal to the County Board of Revision was the appropriate legal mechanism, and that the board would not convene until February, and that in the meantime the county's right to place and enforce the lien was legally sound, and that there was, in his considered opinion, nothing to be done about it before the November 22nd deadline except to pay the $89. He had charged her $3 for the consultation. She had paid it. She now had $23. The friend in Cincinnati wrote back to say she was sorry and that she hoped something could be worked out. The Ohio Bureau of Taxation did not write back. The morning of November 14th was clear and very cold, the first hard freeze morning of the season, and John Wayne arrived in Greenville, Ohio, at 7:45 in the morning, in a black Ford Model T that he had borrowed from a man named Charlie Forrest at the livery in Dayton, where he had spent the previous 2 days meeting with feed suppliers about a contract that would provision the small cattle operation he had been running in the hill country west of San Antonio for the past 3 years. He was 36 years old that year, not the rancher patriarch of his later decades, but already a large and settled presence, the kind of man who occupied space in a room without trying to occupy it. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world was not built to his scale. He had been born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, in 1907, and had grown up in California and had spent his young adulthood doing things that were hard and physical and underpaid. Working as a laborer, a prop man, a bit actor in pictures that nobody much remembered, and had somewhere along that road developed the quality that people noticed first, which was not his size or his looks but his stillness. He was still in the way that useful things are still. He did not move until he was ready to move, and when he moved, he had already decided where he was going. He had no connection to Annie Oakley. He did not know her personally, though everyone in the country knew of her. He had come to Darke County because Charlie Forrest's cousin operated a grain elevator on the south edge of Greenville and had told Charlie that a contact there might have information about Ohio agricultural markets that would be useful to someone in Wayne's situation, and that it was worth a day's drive to find out. It was that provisional and that simple. He had arrived in Greenville with no particular agenda beyond a conversation with a grain elevator operator, and he had stopped at the diner on Main Street for coffee and eggs because he had been on the road since before dawn, and he had been sitting at the counter with his coat still on when he first heard the name. He heard it because the 2 men on the stools to his left were talking about it. They were farmers, he guessed. The particular wear of their hands and the particular tilt of their hats suggested men who worked ground for a living, and they were talking in the way men talk when they are not arguing, but have not yet agreed on what they think. One of them, a heavy-set man with a wool scarf still around his neck, said that it was a damn shame and that somebody ought to say something. The other, thinner, with a week of gray beard, said that saying something was easy and that paying $89 was harder, and that he didn't see what could be done about it. The heavyset man said that it wasn't right, using the assessment the way they did, and that Annie Oakley of all people shouldn't have to. And then he stopped, because his companion had made a small gesture with his coffee cup that meant someone nearby might be listening. John Wayne did not look up from his plate. He ate his eggs and finished his coffee and left a quarter on the counter, and he stood outside the diner in the cold for a moment, looking at the main street of Greenville, Ohio, which was a modest street on a modest morning, and then he walked to the end of the block and into the hardware store, because it was open and warm, and because, in his experience, hardware store owners knew what was happening in a town. The owner's name was Walt Grimm, and he was 60 years old and had operated the store since 1901, and he had the dense, specific knowledge of a man who had sold nails and rope and lamp oil and pipe fittings to everyone in the county for 20 years. He knew the story, because everyone in the county knew the story. The supplemental assessment, the deadline, the $89, the fact that she had been to the assessor's office and to a lawyer, and that neither had been able to help. He told it straightforwardly, without embellishment, the way you might tell someone the price of a hardware item. This is the situation. These are the numbers. Here is why it cannot be easily fixed. He mentioned that the same methodology had hit Loretta Brandt and Caleb Rowbottom, that Brandt had scrambled and paid, and Rowbottom was still dealing with the aftermath of the lien. He said the county assessment office wasn't bad people, just a bad system, and that the bad system was going to foreclose on Annie Oakley if nothing changed by November 22nd, and that it would be a disgrace, but disgrace was something the county commission seemed to have a higher tolerance for than most. John Wayne thanked him and bought a box of 16-penny nails that he had no use for, and he walked out into the cold. He drove past the farmhouse twice. The first time he slowed without stopping, taking in the property, the white clapboard house, the green door, the small barn, the lane with its ridged frozen mud, the sycamores along the creek, bone white in the November light. A property that looked cared for, a property that looked like someone had recently put intention into it. The second pass was slower, and this time he saw what he needed to see. The envelopes was still on the door, or a second one had been placed there, because there was something tacked there, white against the green paint, catching the thin winter sun. He did not stop. He drove back to Greenville. He found the Greenville Savings and Trust on the east side of Main Street, a solid brick building with the bank's name cut into the limestone lintel above the door. He pushed through the door and stood for a moment in the warmth of the lobby, which had the particular smell of a county bank, wood polish and paper, and the faint metallic tinge of coin. There were 2 teller windows and a desk near the back where the manager sat. The manager was a man named Horace Bellamy, 45 years old. Wire-rimmed glasses, the look of a man who had given a lot of bad news in his career, and had learned to give it without visible discomfort. John Wayne walked past the teller windows and straight to Bellamy's desk. He said good morning. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, without being invited to, not rudely, just with the easy authority of a man who had sat across from a great many desks in his life. He asked Horace Bellamy what he knew about the Annie Oakley assessment situation. Bellamy studied him for a moment, took in the height and the stillness, and whatever else registered in those first seconds. And then he said that the bank was not directly involved, that it was a county tax matter. Wayne nodded. He asked whether Bellamy was aware that the county's lien provision, if exercised, could complicate the property's title status in ways that would affect any future banking instruments connected to it. Bellamy said that was technically accurate. Wayne asked whether the bank held any other instruments associated with properties that had been caught by the new assessment. Bellamy's expression shifted slightly, not alarm, just a recalibration of how seriously he was taking this conversation. He said that a number of their customers had been affected. Wayne said he understood. He said he was thinking about making a deposit. He said he wanted to understand the town's situation before he did. Bellamy was quiet for a moment. Then he told Wayne what he knew, which was more than the hardware store owner had known and more precise in its numbers. The supplemental assessment had affected 19 properties in the Eastern Corridor. 11 had already paid. 4 were in the appeal process and had gotten extensions. Wayne asked how they had gotten extensions, and Bellamy said those were larger properties, with legal representation. The remaining 4, including the Oakley property, had neither paid nor secured an extension, and the December deadline, he caught himself and corrected it. The November 22nd deadline for the Oakley property specifically was hard. The county didn't want to foreclose. The county would foreclose. Those were not contradictory things. Wayne thanked him and stood up. He was at the door when Bellamy said quietly that if someone were minded to help, the cleanest way would be to pay the assessment directly to the county treasurer's office, not through the bank, and get a receipt, and that the treasurer's office was 2 blocks north on Court Street. Wayne did not turn around. He said he appreciated that information. He was standing outside the treasurer's office at 10:45 in the morning. He had $500 in his wallet, money he had planned to use toward the feed contract, money that he could replace in 30 days when his quarterly cattle revenue came through, money that would be inconvenient but not impossible to be without. He was standing outside and he was thinking, not about whether to do this, because that decision had already been made somewhere between the hardware store and the bank, but about how to do it in a way that solved the actual problem and created no new ones. He went in and spoke to the deputy treasurer, a young woman named Clara Havens, who was 22 years old and had been in the position for 8 months, and who recognized Annie Oakley's account number when he mentioned the property address without any apparent difficulty, because it was the only account in the Eastern Corridor that anyone at the treasurer's office had been talking about for 2 weeks. He told her he wanted to settle the outstanding supplemental assessment for that property in full, plus any interest or penalties that might have accrued, and that he wanted a full receipt showing the account cleared to a 0 balance through December 1st. Clara Havens looked at him for a moment. She was a precise and conscientious employee, and she had been taught to ask certain questions in situations like this, and she asked them. Was he a legal representative of the property owner? He was not. Did he have written authorization from the property owner to make payment on her behalf? He did not. Could she ask his relationship to the account? He said he was a neighbor, which was not technically true by distance, but was true in every other sense he meant it. Clara Havens was quiet for a moment, and then she made a decision that was not covered by her training, which was to take the money, because the money was legal tender, and the assessment was a lawful debt, and nothing in the Ohio Revised Code prohibited a third party from paying a lawful debt. The amount, with 1 week of accrued late interest at the county's statutory rate of 4% annually, came to $89.68. John Wayne set a $100 bill on the counter. He waited while Clara Havens processed the payment, counted his change, $10.32, and printed the receipt. The receipt was a standard county form, pale green, with the property address and the owner's name and the amount paid and the date, and a confirmation stamp from Clara Havens' desk, and, in the space for the payer's name, the name she had asked him for, and that he had given her, J. Morrison, not John Wayne, just Morrison. Clara Havens folded the receipt into a county envelope and slid it across the counter. He paid $10.32 back in change, and asked Clara Havens to keep it toward any other outstanding assessments on properties in the Eastern Corridor that hadn't yet paid. She stared at him. He said he was serious. She put the money in a separate drawer and made a handwritten note on a piece of county stationery that she dated and kept in the drawer with money because she was that kind of employee. Nobody in that room moved for a moment after he left. He drove back to the farmhouse on the Ansonia Road. It was 11:30 in the morning, and the sun was almost warm in the windshield, and the frozen mud of the lane crunched under the Ford's tires as he pulled up short of the front porch. He sat in the car for a moment. The house was quiet. There was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant she was home, and there was a fire going, which meant someone was awake inside. He did not want to knock on the door. Knocking on the door would require explanation, and explanation would require a conversation he did not want to have. Not because he was reluctant to explain himself, but because explanation would shift the weight of the moment onto her, and she had been carrying enough weight. He got out of the car and walked to the green door and tacked the county envelope just below the original notice. Below it, not over it, so she would see both. And he tacked it with a single nail from the box of 16-penny nails he had bought at Grimm's hardware store that morning, and which he had been carrying in his coat pocket for no reason he would have been able to articulate at the time, and which now seemed, in the way that small things sometimes do, to have been carried for exactly this purpose. He pressed the envelope flat against the door with 2 fingers. It was a pale green envelope against a green door, and you would not see it from the lane, but you would see it the moment you opened the door. He walked back to the Ford. He did not look at the house again. He turned the car around on the lane, the frozen mud groaning under the wheels, and he drove back toward Greenville at the same unhurried pace he had arrived at. And he was back on the Dayton Road by noon. He had been in Darkey County, Ohio, for 4 hours and 17 minutes. There is no record of whether Annie Oakley heard the Ford on the lane that morning. She was not sleeping. She had not been sleeping well since the envelope arrived. The way you do not sleep well when there is a number in your head that does not have a solution attached to it. She had been in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a car on the lane, and she had gone to the window and seen the black Ford moving away, already at the far end of the lane near the road, already almost gone in the flat November light. She did not see the driver clearly. She would say later, to Frank, and to no one else for many years, that she had seen a large man and a dark coat, and that the car turned north on the Ansonia Road and was gone before she had finished looking. She opened the front door in the cold and saw the county envelope below the original notice, and she took both envelopes inside, and she opened the green one first because it was the new one. She stood at the kitchen table and read the receipt. She read it twice. She read the stamped confirmation and the date and the amount and the payer's name, J. Morrison, and she set the receipt on the table, and she stood there in the kitchen with the wood stove, making its small sounds, and Frank, asleep in the next room, and the sycamores along the creek, bare and white in the November light. And she was not a woman given to displays of feeling. She never had been, but she stood there for a long time before she moved. She did not know the name J. Morrison. She would not connect it to John Wayne for several years, and the connection she eventually made was tentative. A mutual acquaintance mentioned a year and a county, and a physical description that aligned, nothing conclusive. The name on the receipt was all she had, and she kept the receipt. That was the thing about Annie Oakley. She was precise about what she kept. She kept records. She kept accounts. She kept the things that mattered in the physical form in which they mattered. She did not tell the story publicly. She mentioned it to Frank that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, while the fire burned down, and Frank had listened without interrupting, which was his habit. And when she finished, he said that whoever it was must have known what they were doing, and that it was a good thing. That was all. It was a good thing. In the weeks that followed, Greenville talked about it. Walt Grimm at the hardware store talked about it. Because he had spoken to the man who had asked the questions. And Walt was not a gossip, but he was a citizen with opinions about the way the county was using its assessment powers. And this seemed relevant. Horace Bellamy at the bank talked about it to the assistant manager and the assistant manager's wife, who mentioned it to several people at the Methodist church. Clara Havens at the treasurer's office said nothing officially but confirmed. When asked by a reporter from the Greenville Daily Advocate 3 weeks later that the assessment on the Oakley property had been paid, and the account was cleared, and she was not in a position to discuss details of individual accounts. The reporter ran a small item on page 4 that said the county assessment controversy had been resolved in at least one notable case. The item did not name Jay Morrison. Horace Bellamy read the item and said nothing. The other $10.32 that John Wayne had left with Clara Havens went, by her careful accounting and entirely on her own initiative, toward a partial payment on Caleb Rowbottom's outstanding account. She wrote him a letter explaining that an anonymous contribution had been applied to his assessment and that his remaining balance was $63.68. Rowbottom wrote back, asking who had paid it, and Clara Havens wrote back that she was not in a position to say. Rowbottom paid the balance himself in January, in 3 installments, working through the winter as a day laborer for a lumber company in Piqua. He and his wife wrote a letter to the county commission that February detailing the hardship caused by the supplemental assessment methodology. 3 other landowners wrote similar letters. The commission reviewed the methodology the following spring and made modifications that softened the impact on recent purchasers, though the changes did not come quickly enough to help the 4 families whose cases had been most acute in November of 1923. That was the last time John Wayne came to Darke County, Ohio. There is no record that he ever returned. Frank Butler died in November of 1926, 3 years after the morning of the green envelope. He died quietly, as he had lived quietly in those last years. His health had failed by degrees over those 3 years, and Annie had watched it fail, with the same attention she brought to everything, trying to identify what could be fixed and fixing it, and accepting what could not. He died 28 days before she did. She had always suspected she would go when he did, not because she was sentimental about it, but because she was accurate about herself, and she understood that certain things had been organized around a particular center, and when the center shifted, the rest would follow. She died on November 3, 1926. She was 66 years old. She had never been rich. She had been, at the end of her life, in a farmhouse she owned outright along Painter Creek, in the county where she had been born, which was what she had wanted. The farmhouse stood. That was something. The 47 acres along Painter Creek, and the white clapboard, and the green door, and the hand pump well in the side yard. All of it stood, administered first by a trust, and then by a Darke County Historical Preservation Committee that was established in 1928 with a small endowment from several individuals who had known Annie Oakley or had known people who had. The committee maintained the property modestly through the Depression years, which were hard years of preservation, as for everything else, and through the war years and into the post-war period, when interest in Darke County's most famous resident began to grow in ways that surprised people who had not been paying attention to how large her reputation remained in the wider culture. By the autumn of 1924, 1 year after the morning John Wayne had driven down the lane in the pre-freeze cold, the farmhouse kitchen garden that Annie had planted in April of that year had produced, with a generosity the soil hadn't shown in years, 43 pounds of dried beans stored in the root cellar, 7-quart jars of green tomato preserves on the kitchen shelf, and enough winter squash stacked along the barn wall to last well into February. She had put 4 dozen eggs into the county fair exhibition that September, and though she was not competing in any shooting events anymore, the steel brace on her leg made the stance she had used her entire career into, something that required adjustment, and she was still adjusting. She had attended the fair and walked the grounds and met the people who wanted to meet her, which was more people than she expected, and she had done it with the particular grace of someone who has been gracious for so long that it no longer requires effort. She was home. The assessor's letter was a pale green document in a carved wooden box in the bedroom dresser. She had organized it between the deed to the property and a photograph from the 1884 season with Buffalo Bill's show, which was her preferred organizational logic. These were the documents that proved the home was hers. Frank had been better that autumn than he had been the autumn before. Not well, his hands still shook, and his breathing was effortful, but better. They had walked together along the creeks, afternoons, following the line of sycamores south toward the bridge on the county road. Not far, just far enough to be outside and together in the particular quality of Ohio autumn light, which is unlike light anywhere else, amber-edged and low and somehow more generous than the summer light that preceded it. He had told her, on one of those walks, that he was glad they had come back. She had said she was too. Those were the kinds of sentences that decades of working partnership produce: short, accurate, loaded to the limit with what has not been said, because it does not need to be. What a single act of uncredited generosity had made possible was simply this: that she had been allowed to go home and stay there, and die in the place she had chosen, in possession of the things she had paid for. It seems like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was, in the particular arithmetic of what property means to people who grew up without it, everything. She had paid off her mother's mortgage when she was 15, and she had understood ever since that a paid-for home was not a luxury or an achievement. It was the precondition for every other kind of dignity. Someone had kept that precondition in place for her, in November of 1923, for $89.68, and had not waited around to be thanked. The Darke County Historical Society was formally established in 1928, and within its first decade it had begun collecting oral histories and documents related to the county's notable residents. Among the materials donated to the society in the early 1930s by Frank Butler's estate, administered by a nephew in Cincinnati named James Butler Hollis, who was meticulous and thorough in a way that his uncle would have approved of, was the carved wooden box from the bedroom dresser. Inside the box were the deed to the Ansonia Road property, signed and notarized in April of 1923, a photograph from the 1884 Wild West show season. Annie Oakley in the foreground, with a rifle and a stillness that the camera had caught with unexpected precision. Several letters bound with a piece of twine, and a pale green receipt from the Darke County Treasurer's office, dated November 14, 1923, showing payment of $89.68 against the outstanding supplemental tax assessment on property located at Rural Route 4, Ansonia Road, Greenville Township, Darke County, Ohio. The owner's name printed on the receipt was Annie Oakley. The payer's name, written in the neat hand of a 22-year-old deputy treasurer named Clara Havens, was J. Morrison. The box was placed in the Society's archives, catalogued, and housed. For years it was examined primarily by researchers interested in Annie Oakley's shooting career or her time with the Wild West show, and the pale green receipt was noted and recorded, and noted again. There were, over the decades, individuals who made the connection between J. Morrison and the man who had become John Wayne, and who mentioned it in footnotes and in letters. And once, in 1951, in a brief passage in a magazine article about Wayne that listed the anecdote among other unverified acts of generosity attributed to him over the years. The article was read by a researcher in Columbus named Helen Darity, who spent 8 months in 1952 attempting to verify the connection conclusively, tracing the receipt back to Clara Havens' records, finding the handwritten note that Clara Havens had made in the separate drawer about the remaining $10.32, tracking down Caleb Rowbottom's correspondence with the treasurer's office, and eventually concluding, in a paper she submitted to the Ohio Historical Quarterly in the fall of 1953, that the circumstantial evidence was strong, and the documentary evidence was consistent, and that while definitive confirmation required either a first-person account from Wayne himself or a contemporaneous witness, the balance of the record strongly supported the identification. By the time the paper was published, John Wayne was 50 years old, and one of the most recognized figures in American public life, and the story had circulated enough in Ohio historical circles that several journalists had asked him about it directly. He said, in each case, that he did not recall all the places he had been in the 20s, and that Darke County was a fine county, and that Annie Oakley had been one of the great Americans of her generation, which was true but was not exactly an answer. Walt Grimm's hardware store closed in 1947 when Walt died, and his son decided to take a job in Dayton. The building was sold and became a pharmacy, and then a dry goods store, and eventually a real estate office. Horace Bellamy retired from the Greenville Savings and Trust in 1939 and lived in the same house on Vine Street until 1961, and was known, in his later years, as a man who had become somewhat more generous in his lending practices than bank regulations strictly required. Clara Havens married a farmer named Roy Ashford in 1926 and moved to a property 6 miles south of Greenville and worked as a bookkeeper for a feed cooperative for 30 years and was by all accounts an exceptionally precise and reliable bookkeeper. She died in 1979. The carved wooden box is in the Darke County Historical Society's collection. The receipt is inside it, the pale green paper still legible, the confirmation stamp still clear. The Society opened a dedicated exhibit on Annie Oakley in 1966, and the box was placed in a glass case near the center of the exhibit, and beside it was a typed card that explained the contents and noted the unresolved question of the payer's identity, with the careful language that serious archives use for things they believe, but cannot fully prove. School children from Greenville and the surrounding townships visited the exhibit on field trips throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, and many of them read the card, and a certain number of them understood what they were reading, and a smaller number of them remembered it for the rest of their lives. This image of a pale green envelope on a green door, a country road in November, a large man in a dark coat who had driven away before she woke up, and the specific grace of a thing done completely and without any need to be seen doing it. In the summer of 1989, a 12-year-old girl from Greenville named Ruth Ashford, a great-granddaughter of Clara Havens, visited these exhibit on a school trip and stood in front of the glass case for longer than the rest of her class, reading the typed card about the receipt, and looking at the pale green document inside. And when her teacher called the group to the next display, she stayed for another moment, looking at the name written in her great-grandmother's careful hand. She was a serious child, and she was learning, at 12, that the world contains a certain number of acts that are complete in themselves. Acts that do not require acknowledgement, do not generate legacy, do not ask anything of the person they help, except that they go on living, which was the only thing they ever wanted to do in the first place. She looked at the name for a long moment, and then she went to catch up with her class. The pale green receipt is still there, the name J. Morrison is still there in Clara Havens' neat handwriting, and whoever wrote it on a cold November morning in 1923 wrote it knowing exactly what it meant, which was that the debt was paid, that the home was safe, and that the woman inside it had not been asked for anything in return except, perhaps, the dignity of not having to know who had done it. That was what it had cost him, in the end. Not the $89.68, which was an inconvenience and nothing more, but the discipline to leave the receipt on the door and drive away before the door opened, because some gifts only remain gifts if they are never collected, and he had understood that, and he had understood it precisely, the way she would have.